It's Monday, January 13th. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. From the early days of the internet to the ubiquity of social media and surging artificial intelligence growth, today on the show we will look at how all of that is impacting us, and I will ask my guest, should we worry about a tech dystopia? So this is one of those shows that I was lining it up before the holidays. I was like, I'd like to have someone to come in and talk about tech and the internet. And I was thinking the whole quarter of a century, right, for the 21st century. Then there's been a bunch of tech news that has been going on. And over the last couple of days, the show has been remolded from the initial kind of, thoughts on it, and it's solidified under that question, right? Should we worry about a tech dystopia? Now, that sounds pretty scary when you're talking about dystopias, but there's lots to talk about here, and through this show, we will go through some internet history, how all, from the beginning to now, how certain things have impacted us, how perhaps certain things have gone off the rails, and then we're also going to talk about what could be fixed and the importance of looking for solutions, even if they're hard or maybe even impossible at times. So that's where we are. To set things up, take a listen to this.
At Google, our mission is to make the world's information accessible and useful. It's an incredible resource. I mean, in history, you have never had access to just, pretty much all the world's information in seconds.
Well, what we're going to do is get rid of all these buttons and just make a giant screen. Well, we're going to use a pointing device that we're all born with. We're born with 10 of them. We're going to use our fingers. iPhone runs OS 10.
What is the Facebook exactly?
It's an online directory that connects people through universities and colleges through their social networks there. And now we're at 100,000 people, so who knows where we're going next.
The reason to develop AI at all is that I believe this will be, in terms of impact on our lives and improving our lives and upside, this will be the greatest technology humanity has yet developed.
Hi, I'm ChatGPT, your AI assistant here to help with anything you need. How can I help today?
All right, you might have recognized the voices there. One of them, Google's founders, Sergey Brin, Steve Jobs announcing the iPhone, Mark Zuckerberg on, then Facebook before Meta, Sam Altman, ChatGPT, and then you had some ChatGPT right at the end. Paris Marx is with me again on the show, critic of tech futures, host of the podcast Tech Won't Save Us, author, Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. Hi, Paris, how you doing?
I'm doing well.
Yeah, I mean, not exactly a light topic for today, but this is the reason why you're here. This is what you talk about.
Totally. You think about the difference between, the original question posed, is this a tech dystopia? Are we looking at a tech dystopia? And you consider that with the clips that you just played and what we were thinking about in the past and how far we've come,
Yeah. and I think that for the first half of the show, that's going to be a lot of the conversation, right? How far we've come from the early days. I still remember being a grade 6 student and being really disappointed with where in the world is Carmen Sandiego because it was MS-DOS. And I was like, it's not doing anything.
Yeah.
And then a few years later, it did do something. And now a whole lot more. So folks, here's where I'd like you to come into this today. If you've got questions or comments about the tech conversation and that question, should we worry about a tech dystopia? Do you worry about it? Thoughts on what should be done around that? Text us, 709-327-8206, or email thesignal@cbc.ca. Before we do our little history tour, Paris, I was looking at tell us disconnect. It says rejuvenated, refreshed, and ready for whatever new nightmares tech has in store. What is disconnect? And tell us just about that piece from a couple of days ago.
Yeah, disconnect is just a newsletter that I write to, share my thoughts on tech and the tech industry with the people who want to read them, basically. I think we're heading into 2025 now. I think we've seen what happened in 2024 with, the alliance between Elon Musk and Donald Trump that is very prominent now, that a lot of people have seen, the growing questions around AI and what real impact that is going to have. And I think the growing recognitions of like the energy costs and the climate costs that is coming with that, because, these tools that, they seem like you just use ChatGPT and, your computer does it and you don't think about anything else that happens behind the scenes, but they're actually very energy intensive, very resource intensive. And as a result, we have tech companies like running around the world trying to find enough energy to power all these things. But then there's this, I think, broader realignment that we've been seeing happen in the tech industry, where, I think is best exemplified by what we've seen from Mark Zuckerberg over the past week, where, all of a sudden he says he's getting rid of fact checking on Facebook and really changing the types of things that are allowed to be said, acceptable to be said, and changing a lot of policies internally at the company as well, to make sure that they're not worried about diversity anymore, that they're not taking initiative to try to make, LGBTQ people feel welcome there. All these sorts of things are changing as we see this incoming Trump administration and this embrace of, extreme right-wing movements around the world by a lot of tech billionaires and founders and things as well.
Yeah, well phrased, because I'm just looking at the notes from the beginning of your piece. And yeah, exactly. AI wreaking havoc on the climate, Elon Musk, Silicon Valley paying fealty to the MAGA movement, looking at 2025. You also mentioned, this got some, because you talk, it's not just in this province or nationally. You talk globally about tech all the time, right? You put a post out on X, formerly Twitter, about Facebook, saying Facebook is a social cancer. And that got a bit of attention?
Yeah. I've certainly had some media organizations reach out to me about that, including yourself, of course, mentioning it. I think my real point with that, and this is even before all the things that Zuckerberg has done over the past week, is really just to recognize that, that clip you played of Zuckerberg earlier, where he was talking about the Facebook at the time, there was a the in front of it when it was very early days, and it had 100,000 users, right? Now I think it's more than 3 billion, the number of people who rely on this platform. And I think we've seen over time, there has been this shift in, how the platform works, the type of things that circulate on the platform. Of course, people will know if you visit Facebook or Instagram today and try to access legitimate news sources, you will be blocked from doing so because that can't be shared on the platform. Meanwhile, it does feel like, and I think that these changes that Zuckerberg is doing right now is going to make it even worse, that it seems like a place where conspiracy theories kind of spread really far and wide before they can be debunked or fact-checked or anything like that. And I think that is having a bigger negative influence on our societies, on the discourses that our societies have, on what we understand to be the reality that we're living in. And I don't think that we're fully grappling with that yet. And so that's kind of where that comment comes from.
Yeah, and folks, we've got a lot more to talk about on the Facebook file in the second half of the show. And for folks who are wondering about your critiques, how you look at tech, you focus, we're not talking small local tech companies for what you're talking for, where you focus. You focus on essentially Silicon Valley and power, right?
I'm very focused on the people and the companies that are shaping our lives, right? And so, sure, there might be local tech companies that might have some effect on things that happen in our very local lives. But even then, they won't be all that significant, I think it's fair to say. I'm more focused on the Elon Musks of the world, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Jeff Bezos, of Amazon. These major companies that are now some of the largest companies on the entire planet, that are often headquartered in the United States, but that operate globally and that shape so much of what our lives now look like, because the internet has become so dominant, because these companies have become so dominant. And now that our governments are trying to grapple with the power that these companies have been able to build up over the past few decades, it feels like they're really struggling, they're, late to the game, but it also feels like now that they're even trying to, bring in regulations and things like that, it feels like the companies are constantly pushing back or say, blocking news instead of abiding by a Canadian government law. And it seems like we're having a really hard time kind of grappling with and reckoning with these changes to our society that these tech companies have brought on. And part of that is because, that narrative that we used to have, that anything these companies were doing was progress, was making the world a better place. And now I think we've seen that as they've become some of the biggest companies in the world, some of the richest people in the world, that, that has not really been the case, right?
And then you see some of them with, like you mentioned, Musk, tables down at Mar-a-Lago, right, with Donald Trump, trying for influence and discussions around the future of their companies, and also the future for lots of folks, depending on what type of influence they're putting in the ear of the incoming president of the United States of America.
Totally. If you look at what's happening in the United States right now, and like imagine something like this happening in Canada, right? You're having all of the big tech companies and big CEOs give $1 million to Trump's inauguration. Can you imagine if like a tech company in Canada or any kind of company gave like $1 million to the incoming prime minister's swearing in ceremony or something? Yeah. Like it's just so wild to even imagine like the kind of blatant corruption that happens there. But they're all kind of coming through Mar-a-Lago to have their little chat with Donald Trump to see what their priorities are going to be. And I think with someone like Zuckerberg, for example, and the changes that he's making, you can very clearly see how, it's affecting how these companies operate. And these companies are making decisions based on what is happening in the United States, the kind of political shifts that are happening there. But those changes are going to apply to us in Canada, are going to apply to people in Europe and Brazil and many other parts of the world, regardless of what the actual kind of domestic situations in those countries are. It's whatever happens in the United States, and we just kind of have to live with it, right?
Let's go back in time to 1995. Sure. And I've got, here's a clip. It's about just under a minute. It's Bill Gates on The Late Show with David Letterman back in 95. Take a listen.
What about this internet thing? Do you know anything about that?
Sure.
What the hell is that exactly?
Well, it's become a place where people are publishing information.
Right.
So everybody can have their own homepage. Companies are there, the latest information. It's wild what's going on. You can send electronic mail to people. It is the big new thing.
Yeah, but it's easy to criticize something you don't fully understand, which is my position here.
Go ahead.
But I can remember a couple of months ago, there was like a big breakthrough announcement that on the internet or on some computer deal, they were going to broadcast a baseball game. You could listen to a baseball game on your computer. And I just thought to myself, does radio ring a bell? You know what I mean?
So no one accusing David Letterman of The Late Show with David Letterman of being a forward-thinking tech type person there, but
that's my criticism as well. It's just like the radio.
It's just like the radio. Well, hey, and some people are listening over the World Wide Web right now. Yeah. Whoa, mind-blowing. 95. Gosh, sounds different.
Yeah. I was pretty young at the time.
Yeah, you were pretty young at the time.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that clip, and just when you think of where we are now. And thoughts on just kind of like, what is this new thing that people are using? You can send electronic mail. Great.
Yeah. My first thought actually is it's so funny to hear Bill Gates say those sorts of things because like in the 90s, Bill Gates was like one of the biggest monopolists going, right? Yeah. Like the end of the 1990s, that man is like reviled. Microsoft is dragged through the courts in the United States. It's threatened to be broken up. And of course, he's remade his image by giving away a ton of money as this like wonderful philanthropist. But like he got all that money through monopolization and commercialization and kind of controlling key markets, right? And that's kind of what happens in 1995. So the internet is originally this thing that is developed by the U.S. military and then is kind of deployed in research purposes. So universities and, researchers can use it to communicate with one another and things like that, early email and those sorts of things. But in 1995 is really when the internet is privatized. And so this is when, the public backbone of the internet in the United States, so like the infrastructure that connects up a lot of these servers that are around the country, gets decommissioned and is essentially given over to the private sector, and restrictions on commercial operations on the internet have basically been rolled back by that period. And so that is really like the starting gun for the internet of today, right? How those sorts of things really get started. Early companies get founded in the years after that that we know. And of course, the initial privatization kicks off this huge, influx of capital in the United States in particular that we often call the dot-com boom, where from 1995 through to the end of that decade, there's this mass influx of money. If you start any kind of internet company, you're probably going to get funded regardless of whether it's going to actually do anything. And of course, there's a big shaking out in 2000. Yeah, exactly. As always happens with these things, right? But that is kind of the story of what happens there. And it really helps to set the model for what we understand the internet to be today.
How then had like the original promise of the web? How did it erode over time? Then, from like your vantage point, your point of view.
Yeah, well, I think it really is that commercial piece of it, right? And the way that privatization and the way that commercialization really happened. So there were a lot of early narratives. People will probably be familiar with them to a certain degree, right? That the internet was going to allow us to communicate with one another. It was going to bring us together. It was going to be the space where we could have these artistic and discursive pursuits, and it was going to enhance our freedom and be also wonderful, right? That was like the initial vision that came from a lot of early kind of computer activists and stuff who had kind of more libertarian leanings and really wanted to believe that this was the kind of future we were going to have. But what you really see is around the privatization of the internet, there is a fight as to what this is actually going to look like, right? And how it is going to be regulated and the type of approach that we're really going to take with the internet. And I would say think of previous media and communications technologies and compare U.S. regulatory approaches and how the U.S. tends to do these things with other parts of the world, right? If you think about media in the United States, you often have private media companies. Sure, there might be some regulations on how they operate, but those have been pulled back over time. But it's essentially given over to the private sector, and funding is often through advertising or subscription, right? But if you think of Canada or Europe, what we often have is that, yes, we have private media, but we also have public broadcasters. We often have stronger regulation. We often have more public funding that goes into ensuring that there's a degree of public good and, education and all this kind of stuff that we also want to be happening through these technologies. But because this model is set in the United States, it's the U.S. model that essentially kind of dominates the internet, right? It has to be all private companies. The government can't be involved in things. There's no idea of a public broadcaster for the internet or some kind of public alternative. All that is really out the window. And that goes along with the ideas that were kind of dominant in policy and government circles at the time, that the government should be pulling back, should be leaving more things to the private sector. And so I think that is kind of, that framework is how we get to where we are today, where these companies have been able to get away with doing a lot for a long time, regardless of whether it was harmful or not. And now we're trying to deal with those problems that we probably could have tried to address earlier on, but we really wanted to believe that, this was the great future that was being built.
And how much of it too is that when sometimes, especially in the United States, if you look at some of the senators, folks can be older, and yes, we're in a different time now, 2025. But as the internet kind of got up and running, if you're looking at legislation, it always felt like, to me, kind of watching it as this outside observer growing up, that you had a lot of folks who were kind of behind the times with understanding what things could mean, and that and we're always playing catch up to get to the point of well, actually, what kind of legislative discussion should we be having on this, and are we up to date now, or are we still behind, and are they still further ahead than where we need to be?
Yeah, I think that's always part of the discussion, right? Yeah. Especially when we're thinking about the United States and how old their lawmakers tend to be. And of course, they've gotten older over time because they just don't leave office.
That's true, too.
Yeah. But, the other piece of it, too, is if you're thinking about the 1990s, the administration that really privatizes the internet is Bill Clinton and Al Gore. And, they're relatively young at the time, right?
Yeah.
And they have really bought into the promise of the internet. Al Gore is kind of jokingly often called the inventor of the internet. Right. Or whatnot, right? At the time, it used to be the information superhighway that really he was very focused on. But even he had certain ideas for, wanting to ensure that there was a certain amount of bandwidth that was dedicated to, kind of nonprofit and educational concerns and all these sorts of things that were eventually kind of taken out of the regulations in the end, because the people who really won the fight over how the internet was going to look, how it was going to be regulated, were these more kind of free market conservatives. That ended up being more influential in shaping those sorts of policies. And so that is how we start to see, one, this kind of takeoff in, all this investment coming from Wall Street, from various investors wanting to, grow these markets. But then over time, also not really having the tools to properly regulate what was coming out of there. And of course, the industry was very successful in shaping a narrative around how positive this was going to be for everybody, how, technology is always associated with progress. So, Silicon Valley and the tech companies should be able to do what they want to do. And of course, there was also the idea then that, governments can't really infringe on what these companies are doing, or it becomes an infringement on the rights of their citizens to engage with what happens online. And that's not just a U.S. discussion, but because the internet is a product of the United States, and because it's privatized there, and American companies are the ones that get early access to capital, so they can grow a lot easier. They have access to a bigger market earlier on. They have a leg up in kind of starting to dominate this new economy that emerges online before, say, Canadian companies or European companies or something like that. And that is part of the issue I think that we face today as well, where we think of our internet sector in Canada, it's so dominated by American companies. And if a Canadian company kind of starts to try to compete with it, that is very difficult, if not impossible.
Yes, and then it leads to some productivity issues for the country, which
Absolutely.
we talked about last week, and we're going to have actually a little bit about Canadian productivity on the show tomorrow as well. A little insert into tomorrow's show from an audience question. So, folks, when we get your questions, by the way, we try to answer them the best we can. So if you do have questions or thoughts for the show, The Signal at cbc.ca, and you're listening to The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. Today, we're asking, should we worry about a tech dystopia? Do you worry about it? Do you have thoughts on what should be done about that? My guest is Paris Marx, critic of tech futures, host of the podcast Tech Won't Save Us. So if you've got thoughts, text us 709-327-8206. And like I said, the email, thesignal@cbc.ca. So we were doing a bit of a backstory there, right? And we talked about the .com bit and then the bust around year 2000, and then early 2000s, right? You start to, Facebook, I think 04 or something. You get the iPhone in 07, and what was the development then to get us to where we are now for some of these, what were like at the time, like you said earlier in the show, like Facebook, Harvard dorm room type of an idea, and now it's everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many of these things that initially come out of universities, right?
Whatever,
yeah. It's actually really funny. Amazon has this whole story about how it came out of a garage as well, but it was just because this was this was one of the things that you wanted to try to emulate in Silicon Valley. So Jeff Bezos was this guy who worked in a hedge fund before founding Amazon, which was initially called Relentless. And so he knew that if he had this story about it being founded in a garage, it would really help him raise money and, help to sell the company as part of this broader, positive shift and stuff like that, right?
That's interesting.
He rents a house that has a garage, so he can say it was started in a garage, but it wasn't actually, there's plenty of funny, interesting stories like that. But Google comes out of Stanford University. It's initially a research project and then gets spun out into a private company. But I would say, after that .com, boom and then the bust that comes after it, once you get into the latter half of the first decade of the 2000s, you have a lot of really consequential developments there, right? So Amazon in, I believe it's 2006, creates the first kind of cloud computing offerings. And so basically what that is a bunch of centralized servers that are controlled by a company like Amazon. And of course, Google and Microsoft get in on it too, as well as some other bigger companies. But those are the names that people will know, and they're the most dominant in that sector. And basically what this is imagine a big warehouse where you think about goods being stored, right? If you think about ordering from Amazon, that all this stuff is stored in a big warehouse. People go and pick it out and ship it off to you. Well, instead of being filled with goods, it's filled with computers, right? It's filled with computer servers.
Yeah, so when we say the cloud, it's like warehouses upon warehouses filled with servers, all churning, eating up electricity, and that's what's making the cloud.
Exactly. It's not this fluffy immaterial thing.
No, there's some hardwired stuff there that needs to that is just running all the time.
Exactly.
And I don't think people. I don't think about it most of the time. When it's the cloud, like you said, it's the fluffy, it's in the cloud.
It's great branding, right? Because it makes you think that it's absolutely nothing, but actually, it's these massive warehouses that consume a ton of energy and water and stuff like that in order to be what runs the internet, and increasingly so much of what we do online, where so many of the things that we so many of our files are stored and all that kind of thing, right? And so that's the starting point of that. Now we're at a point where that's so much more dominant in terms of not just how the internet works, but how so many companies don't have their own servers, but are just on Amazon, Google, or Microsoft servers instead, right? A company before would have to build out their own, servers to handle their own capacities. But now a lot of these companies would just kind of rent them from Amazon, Microsoft, or Google, which gives them this kind of centralized control over the computation that that runs so much of what we do.
And so does that lay the groundwork then for where we are with AI in this development today? Because when you have these big servers doing all the work, like is that how we get to where we are now with AI?
Exactly. So that kind of like 2-decade progression is how we get to where AI is today. Because, what we've been talking about the past 2 years, AI has been around for decades and decades, right? What we're talking about over the past couple of years with ChatGPT, these chatbots, these image generators is a specific term called generative AI, right? And so that is only really possible because you have this centralized computation, because you can scrape so much information off the entirety of the web, because you have so much computational power available to you to be able to train these models, the size of which we haven't seen before. And so that is what allows them to kind of work better and do things that previous models, previous types of AI haven't been able to do. And so without that centralization that started to happen in the mid-2000s, the first decade of the 2000s, something like generative AI and ChatGPT likely would not be possible today. So yeah, that's like a really consequential development there that leads to something down the line that we're seeing now, right? And of course, the other piece of that, as you mentioned earlier, is the release of the iPhone, which I believe is announced in, I keep getting the years mixed up, but I think it's announced in 2007 or released in 2008.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the App Store comes a year or two later. And, that really transforms how we use the internet and how we use computation, from something that's on a desk or on our lap to something that's always in our pockets or in our phones. It makes things much more immediate and allows these services to be, built out throughout society rather than just, when we're sitting down at a desktop computer or something, right? And so that has been, incredibly consequential. And then, of course, you have the financial crash that happens, 2007, 2008, and that kind of sets the tech industry up to be kind of the savior of the economy, to be the creator of jobs and growth and prosperity into this new era. And because of the low interest rates that persist through much of the 2010s, it means that these companies have very easy access to capital in order to grow and lose money for long periods of time, as long as investors are kind of making their money back through initial public offerings in the stock market.
And how does the pandemic come into this to get us close to where we are now?
Yeah, totally. So the pandemic, of course, so after the financial crash, you have those really low interest rates, right? Yeah. And that basically persists until we start to have the pandemic, until that really disrupts everything. So, people will be familiar with the fact that over the past few years, you've had this, this increase in the interest rates that we're all paying it, but, it applies to what these companies are doing as well. And that means that it's not as easy to access capital. And it also changes how these companies think about, hiring, investment, all these sorts of things, right? So they start cutting a lot of, money-losing projects that maybe they had been working on and aren't really working out, but they were happy to, keep letting it continue under a previous era when money was easier to access than before. And of course, they also cut a lot of employees to try to reduce their costs for those sorts of things and cut their benefits. The story is always, of course, that tech employees have it really good, that, they get their free lunches and
sitting
all this
on
kind of
beanbags, eating free lunches,
exactly.
Going for long walks and taking time off. Yeah,
totally. And some of that gets like rolled back in this justification for cost cutting, right? And of course, the big example of that is when Elon Musk takes over Twitter in 2022.
Brings the kitchen sink in and then gets rid of a bunch of people. Right?
Totally, yeah, totally guts the workforce, the perks that they get, all that sort of stuff. And the other companies in Silicon Valley see that as kind of like permission to start doing something similar, and to not really feel much backlash for it. And so, we really start to see a shift in the way that these companies operate in that period, an idea that they don't need to give as much back and that they really need to prioritize kind of short-term profits and growth over everything else. So you start to see some shifts in that in the past few years that I think we're feeling the effects of today. But yeah, and there really begins to be this transformation where they are more and more angry with government, more and more frustrated with government, vocalizing that publicly in a way that maybe they hadn't as much in the past, that obviously we see the consequences of today.
So that question, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, should we worry about a tech dystopia? What's your answer to that?
Obviously it's a charged question.
Yeah.
But I think yes. I think that we had this narrative for so long that tech was inevitably, a form of progress, right? That as technology improves, things inherently get better. And I think through the 2010s, there was this narrative that even before that look, we were making progress on social rights, by, legalizing gay marriage and, recognizing, the history of how in Canada we had treated Indigenous peoples and trying to, rectify some of those past harms. And, it felt like our society was moving forward and that technology was just one piece of this kind of broader story. And it does feel like, on the one hand, we see in the tech industry that it does feel like things are getting worse now. This kind of link between tech and progress is not as not as solid as maybe we thought before. But I think we're also seeing a threat to this broader kind of social progress that we thought existed as well. With kind of changing political winds and dynamics.
Here, I've got another clip to play, and this brings us up to some of the recent news from Meta, from Facebook, right? So Meta, the company which owns Facebook and Instagram, removing its fact-checking in the U.S. Possible that could mean more hate speech on your screens, folks. Meta will begin allowing users to call out potentially misleading or hateful posts instead of using independent experts and fact-checkers. And the CBC's Leila Baudouin spoke with Memorial University political science professor Amanda Bittner about this. So this was played on the provincial morning shows this morning. I took the end of what Professor Bittner was saying in the interview just to offer us some extra context. And this is actually for that whole bit about the dystopia. For writing the show today, I was listening to this morning, which kind of changed my thoughts around the writing of the show. So give this clip a listen, folks.
Removing the impact of disinformation is really hard to do, and it's not possible to do it completely, which means that once we read things that are filled with hate, that are based on absolutely no evidence, that are based on, the opposite of science, it's really hard to get rid of that. And we're seeing this move coupled with the defunding of education, with the rising cost of education, with lack of access to education, and a lack of respect for science, for education, for any of that kind of stuff. And so this is particularly alarming. So yes, absolutely, it is just like a dystopian novel. And for anybody who's read or who loves to read dystopian novels normally, which I do, I find them increasingly hard to read these days because they feel too true. They feel too real. They feel like things I'm seeing all over the globe right now. So what we're seeing here is governments are, there's a lot of democratic backsliding going on. There is a lot of power being given to a very small group of people. I'm thinking about people like Bezos, like Zuckerberg, like Musk. And the results of that are dangerous and gross, but it's happening. And so how do governments deal with that? Not in the way they're currently dealing with that, that's for sure.
Memorial University political science professor there, Amanda Bittner, who was speaking with CBC's Leila Baudouin, although you didn't hear Leila in the clip. That's who was doing the interview. Paris, thoughts on what Professor Bittner was saying?
Yeah, I certainly agree, right?
Yeah.
I think sometimes like the topic of social media can be a difficult one, right? Because we all engage with it, we all use it, or the vast majority of us, right? And I think it can be difficult to like have a conversation with somebody, when they've seen something online, when they've shared something online that looks like it's fake, or that is fake, and how do you approach that, right? How do you talk to somebody without making them feel that that they're like dumb or something like that for making a mistake and really want to fight back and say like, no, this is real, because I've seen so many posts about it online. And I feel like, as, Dr. Bittner was saying, as we see more and more of this stuff, right, as the changes that Facebook is making to its platforms, that Mark Zuckerberg is making to these social media platforms, makes this stuff even more common, how do we actually deal with that on a societal level? How do we deal with that in interpersonal, conversations and relationships? But how do we deal with that more broadly? Because, as the consequences of, people not having like a common set of facts, so much false information spreading and people believing that it's real, is something that's just common in our societies. It does kind of break down this common conversation that we have, this agreement on maybe like the issues that we're facing, even if we disagree on the right way to address them. I think we're already seeing the consequences of this in like our politics today. But I think it's poised to just get even worse.
Poised to get even worse. Where do you think? Not, I hate asking folks to use a crystal ball on this, but and not to guesstimate, but just analysis on where things might head. When you have Meta saying, "Look, hey, we're going to remove fact check in the U.S. and other places may follow. We've laid out what some of these issues are." Anyone listening, I think, is no stranger to misinformation and disinformation and those conversations online. But then if someone's just like, you know what? No, we're not going to do that anymore at all. Where could things lead, given the prominence of social media, whether it's Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever?
See, I think it's difficult, right? Because even using those terms have been charged as well, right? Because some political actors, even ones that might be on the more like progressive side of the spectrum, will claim that something that they don't like can be misinformation as well, right? You know, we saw this a lot in, say, the American elections, where there was this really strong narrative that like Russia had hacked the election and had taken it from Hillary Clinton and given it to Trump and all this kind of stuff. And like that was not entirely accurate, but some people really ran with it because they really wanted to believe that, like, no, it had to be some external force that made it so that Hillary Clinton couldn't become the president, not because people just really didn't want to see her do that and didn't support her, and maybe they ran a bad campaign and like those sorts of things, right? And so that's why I think people can kind of seize those terms and be like, no, you know, you're making this up, this isn't real, or what have you. But I do think that we very much see a lot of, you know, kind of false information circulating. I think that we can see very clearly that, say, you know, in Canada, we've seen an increase in, you know, kind of racist and anti-migrant sentiment over the past few years. And I think some of that is fueled, yes, by the increase in immigration and the fact that the government wasn't ready to you know, to actually accommodate as many people as it was bringing in. But I think that kind of created an opening for certain forces in society to take advantage of, you know, rising housing costs and rising food prices that we saw from inflation, and to start blaming that on immigrants, and, you know, to kind of lead to, I think, these more negative discussions that we're having today, these policies that are based on, you know, how people feel more than what might actually address the problems. But like that's just one small example to, I think, a broader shift that we're seeing in our politics. And, you know, I think a real shift in how we used to think about these issues that are coming a lot from, you know, social media discourses and false information and things that are coming from other countries, of course. You know, a lot of what is talked about in the United States spreads into Canada, regardless of whether our domestic situation really reflects what's happening down there. But so much of us watch American news and, you know, follow the discourses down there that affects what happens up here too.
So if I think about solutions, right, and because a lot of what you're talking about for when people, it doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum of politics and thought and everything else, a lot of us, yes, when we see something that connects with how we feel inside, we feel it, right? And it's like, oh, that fits. Yes, of course, that's about them or him or whatever. And you move ahead with it, and it's really easy to keep that in your head and to not think about fact checking. But if we're thinking about solutions and some of the damage that this can do, how do you even have that? Like, what? Like, is it legislation? What are some of the conversations that need to be had to think about undoing some of the damage that gets done with all this?
Yeah, that's why it's so hard, right? And,
It's
and
really
if you
hard.
think about the way that the platforms work, right? They have these algorithms that identify the types of things that you are engaging with, that you're consuming, to kind of feed you more of it, right? And all of these platforms are driven by engagement, right? They want you to be engaging more. They want you to be spending more time on the platform so that you are consuming more ads and thus making them more money, right? That's how this business model works. And so if they can kind of prime you with like more extreme content, you know, more kind of sensationalist content, then I think that you see them going in that direction more and more, because they recognize that that is how, you know, they're going to keep you engaged and they're going to make their money and they're going to increase their profits. And so I think that is really like disconnected from what, you know, an information ecosystem or a way of receiving information about the world that we live in, you know, actually leads to like a healthy discourse and something positive, right? I think that the incentives are not aligned with a healthy discourse, with information that is not kind of fake or kind of sensationalized to get us to respond to it in a more emotive way, and thus to want to engage with it more and things like that. And so when I think about responses, like, yes, I think education is obviously a piece of it. I think understanding these issues and how these platforms work is a key piece of it. So, we have some sort of idea of what is actually going on here when we engage with a platform like Facebook or with TikTok or what have you. But I do think that inevitably regulation is a key piece of it, because as individuals, we can't change the way that Facebook operates or any of these other social media platforms, because it's not exclusive to Facebook at all. It's just the easiest example to kind of point to, especially with what Mark Zuckerberg has been at lately. But then that enters into a whole other territory of like difficult conversations where it's like, is the government looking at the right thing? Are they approaching this in the right way? And how to get them to understand the scale of the problem and what the issues actually are. Are they listening to the right people who understand these things? Are they just focused on certain political motivations that they have? I think that we've seen the current Liberal government, not to give them the most credit, but they have been starting to try to engage with these things. I just don't think that they've gotten nearly far enough, right? I think we can look more to the Europeans that have been doing a lot more work on this, have been developing a number of frameworks to try to rein in some of what the tech companies are doing. And as a result, of course, people like Mark Zuckerberg and Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, are trying to get the Trump administration to start bullying other countries to make sure they won't be regulating American tech companies. Australia, of course, has brought in certain regulations. I don't agree with all of them. They have a ban on under 16-year-olds using social media now, which I don't think really addresses the root of the problem. So yeah, there are things that are being tried, not so much in Canada, but in other jurisdictions. But yeah, I think that we need to be working on that a lot more.
We've got a couple notes I want to go to as well, and just to follow through on the promise from the beginning, and we have covered it, but I talked at the beginning of the show, you made some headlines, I called you, I called you anyways, but then looking at a post of saying Facebook is a social cancer. Finish that off for me, because you've talked about Zuckerberg in the last week. You've mentioned some of the issues, but is it I think in the post it says the days of Mark Zuckerberg shaping discourse and controlling communication must end. So I mean that comes down to regulation, right?
Yeah. Inevitably, right? And it goes back to what we've been talking about, right? Yeah. This notion that these tech companies should be able to operate as they see fit in any jurisdiction, and that governments shouldn't be able to kind of push back on what they're doing and make sure that they are actually acting in the public interest rather than just in their own commercial interests, right? In the interest of their shareholders or the people who run them. And I think that we've seen very clearly, especially in the past few years, that these companies have very little concern with the broader public impacts, the broader social impacts of their companies, of what they're doing. And I think that becomes very clear when you look at their alliances with the Trump administration and how, yes, part of that is reflected in changing political beliefs among tech billionaires. And I'm sure if you're one of the richest people in the world, having a government that says we won't, or, a party or a candidate that says we won't tax you, we won't regulate you, we won't hold you accountable, is going to look very appealing. But the other piece of it is, of course, they got frustrated that the Biden administration was starting to regulate them, was starting to talk about taxing them more, was talking about breaking up major tech companies. And so you align with the party that is going to, allow you to continue doing whatever it is that you want, and not have your power reined in. And then, of course, if we take that out of the American context and look at the Canadian context and say, why should this American company, Facebook in this case, but it could be any of the social media companies or American tech companies more broadly, why should they kind of act with impunity? Why should they make their own rules for how they operate in our jurisdiction? We are not the United States, even though Donald Trump talks a lot about making us the 51st state these days. We have different social norms. We have different values. We have a very different political system in Canada than what the United States has. And I don't think it makes sense that we let these American companies decide so much about how they operate in our jurisdictions, and that I think that we need to be much more forceful, our governments, in pushing back on what they are doing to make sure that, yes, if they are going to operate in our jurisdictions, that they abide by our rules, that they abide by our expectations, and that this notion that, we can't regulate the tech companies because, that is some kind of violation of the public's rights or something, I think that really needs to be out the window. And part of this, part of the argument that these companies will use and people who argue against regulation will often use is that, it's a violation of free speech, right? But in Canada, our freedom of expression expectations, the way it's written, always acknowledges that there is a role for government in regulating free expression in our society to, try to address hate speech and to make sure that actually, everybody has the opportunity to express themselves, and that certain groups should not be limited in that because there are so many people who, are saying hateful things about them and pushing back against them and those sorts of things, right?
A couple notes here. One comment text into the show says, I was on Facebook, saw videos and images from the LA fires that are clearly AI, and people in the comments falling for it. Anytime you get a big news story nowadays, which is important, again, it comes down to like that old advice of like trying to see what the source is, where it's from, finding some trusted news sources for your information, but then you will get your memes, your GIFs, your everything else videos now, and they can be suspect because some of them are AI.
Yeah, I think it's become a bigger issue because it's easier to make the AI stuff, right?
Yeah.
You could always make false images, using Photoshop or something like that, or you could grab images from the past, that don't actually show what's going on today. But now with these AI image generators, it's so much easier to create this false information. And I've spoken to people who have looked into this on Twitter or X, Facebook, other social platforms where there is this whole economy of pages and posters who know that they can monetize the fact that if they create very sensationalist content, some of it AI generated, some of it not, that will circulate on these platforms that they're going to make money from that, right?
Yeah.
And so it doesn't matter if, it's real or if it, reflects anything accurate in society, as long as it gets people's emotions going, whether that is in a positive way or a negative way, but I think that the negative emotions can be, kind of tapped into stronger, then they are going to do that because, they're financially incentivized to do it. And that creates serious issues as well.
Yeah, I'm much more. I'm a fan of the cute kitty cats. I could monetize that all day.
Yeah.
Some of this other stuff, no, thank you. Here's another email. Has your guest read Nexus by Yuval Noah Harari, a historical exploration of information networks, illustrating how technology has shaped and reinforced power dynamics? Also, I think Canada needs to allow Google/Facebook to, again, share news media links, as it will further hinder Canadian democracy by not permitting the sharing of information on these social media platforms. Thanks. I'm with David Letterman. RE, have you heard about radio? Yes, I agree with you, Paul, on the radio bit. The rest of it I won't comment on, but thank you so much for your thoughts there. Yeah, so those are two. And have you heard of that book, The Dark Side of Progress?
I've heard of it. I haven't read that one specifically. And Google can share news links. Earlier this month, Google actually distributed $100 million to a collective that represents journalists and news organizations in the country to abide by the law that the government put in to ensure that these major tech companies that profit a lot off the sharing and commenting of news articles on their platforms are contributing back to Canadian journalism. Meta has refused to do that, and that is why. Yeah,
and Google was on board. Meta has refused. So
exactly,
just to be crystal clear on the difference there between both the Google/Facebook on that.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's the same as, for example, for this show, right? We've got the cameras on now. We put it up on YouTube, which is also shareable compared to other news links, depending, right, on where you want to share it on. On Meta and whatever else.
Yeah, I did something with an American media organization last month, and when they shared it on Instagram, I couldn't actually see that they had shared it unless I used the VPN, a virtual private network, to pretend I was in the United States. And then I could see it, no problem, and I could share it, and it was very odd. Yeah.
I got another note here from Daryl. I've been reading science fiction for over 50 years. We're here now. Interesting, great, and at times scary. But all will be well. And Daryl asks if the show is only text or email. It is today, but I will say, Daryl, that if you do want to phone in and leave us a message on the Signal line, folks, and the Signal line's always open. If you have thoughts on the show and you want to voice it, and we'll play that on the show, 719-576-5260 is the Signal line. And again, for emails, thesignal@cbc.ca. So what are you looking at? We only have 5, 6, 7 minutes left of the show here. We've been talking about Mark Zuckerberg and Meta. What are you looking at for the year ahead?
Oh,
so much stuff. So
yeah.
much.
Yeah. Where to start? Listen, obviously, I'm continuing to pay attention to the relationship between tech billionaires and extreme right-wing movements, not just in the United States, but around the world, right? And so we have already seen, Elon Musk, for example, start to get much more engaged in British politics, in supporting initially the, I can't remember the name of the party now, but it's led by Nigel Farage. I think it's Reform UK. And he was kind of the guy who pushed Brexit through. But it seems Elon Musk has now soured on him and now supports a guy named Tommy Robinson, who was the co-founder of the English Defence League, who is a very far-right personality over there. And he also is supporting the Alternative for Deutschland, which is a neo-Nazi far-right party in Germany, and recently had like a live discussion with the leader of that party on his platform X. And so, we've already seen that in other countries as well. I would not be surprised if, as we head closer to an election here in Canada, that we're going to start seeing some engagement by people. Elon Musk has already been tweeting about Justin Trudeau, but some more like explicit engagement from people down south.
Well, and you mentioned that yesterday, in the Guardian. It says, here's the article, folks, if you want to Google it. Canada's election is about to have an Elon Musk problem with Trudeau's exit. The world's richest man looks to move Canada to the right as the beleaguered prime minister prepares to depart. And then the first couple lines are, the decision by Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau this week to resign as head of the Liberal Party has set in motion a leadership race against the backdrop of a looming general election, which will be held amid political turmoil triggered by Donald Trump's America First economic nationalism. It has also given Tesla's CEO Elon Musk an opportunity to inject himself into yet another country's political turmoil. So you can read that in The Guardian. But just to your point, right? This is it's more around the same kind of a topic of what he's doing in different areas.
Exactly. And, people might forget Elon Musk is a Canadian citizen.
That's right.
He's spent some time here. I'm sure that, I would really not be surprised if, as we get closer to an election, as an election is called, he becomes much more engaged in what is going on here. If he's commenting on the UK, why would he not be commenting on Canada? And a lot of these people are more supportive of Pierre Poilievre. He was recently on the Jordan Peterson show. I would not be surprised to see the Conservative Party leader be much more engaged in these sorts of circles to get this social media and online support, because we've seen that be so consequential in the American election just last year, right? I would say beyond that, though, obviously AI remains a important, point of discussion. I think that there's a growing focus on the number of data centers. We were talking about the cloud earlier, and the amount of energy and water and resources that are required for these sorts of things. The major tech companies are talking about needing nuclear power now because they're going to be building so many sites, so many new data centers, and these are very large sites. Countries like Ireland, for example, see more than 20% of their power go to data centers these days.
More than 20% of their power for Ireland.
Yeah.
Because the power bit came up when we were talking about Churchill Falls and the MOU and a look ahead for energy demand as we kind of move to 2041 and beyond, right? But then, and yes, we mentioned the nuclear side of things. I did not know that about Ireland.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we see in Alberta now, and Pierre Poilievre has talked about this as well, that they are talking about attracting AI data centers so that they have a new customer for natural gas. So they don't want it to be powered by renewables, but by fossil fuels, right? And see some opportunity there. I would say beyond that, though, there's so many things happening in the tech industry. You can look at, say, how a lot of these new tech companies and investors are investing more in kind of tech defense companies because they see the opportunity to sell new weapons technologies to the United States military, as it kind of ramps up its confrontations with China and its kind of more aggressive military posturing that you're going to see under the Trump administration, certainly. But yeah, there's so much going on with tech because it impacts so many different aspects of our lives, right?
If people want to follow your newsletter or just follow you and what you're talking about, what you're analyzing, where are the best places to find you?
Yeah, I post on the social media platforms as Paris Marks. I'm on Blue Sky more than anywhere else these days. My podcast is Tech Won't Save Us. It's on any of the podcast platforms. And my newsletter is at disconnect.blog.
Excellent. Thanks so much for this.
Absolutely. It was great fun.
All right, folks. Paris Marks, their critic of tech futures, and as Paris mentioned, host of the podcast Tech Won't Save Us author. Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. That is it for our Monday show. Tomorrow, it got bumped last week because of a certain prime minister announcing some political plans, but it's good to go now. We will talk about this province's cultural legacy and what is being done to preserve it, from historic buildings and landscapes to keeping museums open and running. For you folks, I'd love to hear examples of success and what needs to be done to keep more from being lost to history. The phone lines will be open tomorrow, plus all the other lines for texts and emails and the signal line, you name it. But until then, thanks so much for listening and be safe out there.